The night was unnervingly silent as Alina darted through the dense forest, her breath ragged and her limbs aching. Moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy of leaves, casting ominous shadows that danced along her path. She had been running for hours, perhaps even days, but she could no longer tell. The trees all blurred into one, and every sound seemed amplified in the deafening quiet. Yet, despite the thumping of her heart in her ears, she knew one thing for certain: he was still out there. He was still coming for her. Alina had always lived with fear as a constant companion. Fear of being caught, fear of being discovered, fear of being destroyed. She was different, and in a world where different meant danger, she had become accustomed to staying in the shadows. Her powers had started manifesting a year ago, uncontrollable bursts of energy that lit up the night like fireworks. At first, she had tried to hide it, but the more she tried, the more volatile they became. It wasn't long before others noticed, and once they did, her life turned into a constant game of survival. He had been sent to kill her, Luca, the hunter, trained since birth to hunt and eliminate anything deemed other, anything that threatened the status quo. Alina had heard whispers about him from others like her, about how he was merciless and swift. He never failed, no one escaped him. She had seen him once, from a distance, as he dealt with another outcast like her. The precision, the cold efficiency with which he ended lives, had frozen her blood. She knew that if he caught her, there would be no mercy. Her legs ached with the strain of running, and her lungs burned with every breath, but stopping was not an option. She had to keep going, even though she felt his presence growing closer with each passing moment. The air around her seemed to tighten as if the forest itself was aware of the impending doom. She could sense him now, almost feel the weight of his gaze on her back. Suddenly, her foot caught on a root, and she tumbled forward, landing hard on the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a brief moment, the world spun around her in a dizzying blur. She struggled to get up, but her muscles screamed in protest. Desperation clawed at her chest as she tried to push herself to her feet, but before she could move, a shadow loomed over her. Luca stood there, tall and imposing, his silhouette barely distinguishable against the darkened forest. His eyes, however, seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. They locked onto her with a gaze that was as sharp as a blade, and in that moment, Alina knew her time had run out. She tried to scramble back, but her body refused to cooperate. She could only watch as he slowly drew closer, his every movement deliberate and measured. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Alina's heart pounded in her chest, and her mind screamed at her to do something, to fight back, but all she could do was stare up at him, paralyzed by fear. As he approached, she expected him to strike, to end it all in one swift motion. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the blow that would surely come, but it didn't. Instead, there was only silence. Tentatively, Alina opened her eyes, confused by the absence of pain. Luca was standing just a few feet away, his hand on the hilt of his dagger, but he hadn't drawn it. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something different in his eyes now, something that made her stomach twist in knots. "Why don't you fight?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that sent shivers down her spine. Alina's throat was dry, and her voice trembled when she spoke. I don't want to hurt anyone." His brow furrowed, as if her answer puzzled him. He took another step closer, and she instinctively shrank back, but he made no move to strike. Instead, he knelt down in front of her, his face only inches from hers. His presence was overwhelming, his scent a mixture of leather and wood smoke, and something else, something dangerous. "You could end this," he said, his voice still quiet but intense. "You have power, but you choose to run." Alina swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. She had always known she was different, but she had never seen her abilities as something to wield. They were a curse, a burden that made her a target. The idea of using them terrified her. "I don't want to be a monster," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, Luca was silent, his gaze boring into hers. Then, unexpectedly, his expression softened. It was a subtle change, but it was enough to make Alina's heart skip a beat. His hand, still resting on the hilt of his dagger, relaxed slightly. "You're not a monster," he said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle, "but you're not human either." Alina's breath hitched in her throat. The way he said it, with such certainty, sent a chill down her spine. She had spent her entire life hiding from what she was, denying it, But in that moment, with him so close, she couldn't escape the truth. She wasn't like him, she wasn't like anyone. "I thought," she began, her voice shaky, "I thought you would kill me." Luca's eyes darkened, but not with anger. There was something else there, something she couldn't quite place. "I could have," he admitted. "I should have." Alina's heart raced as he leaned in closer, his breath warm against her skin, her entire body tensed, expecting the worst. But instead of striking, he reached out slowly, almost hesitantly, and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. His touch was surprisingly soft, and it sent a jolt of electricity through her body. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why haven't you?" Luca's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he finally spoke. "You're different," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not like the others I've hunted." Alina's mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. She had always assumed that hunters like Luca saw her kind as nothing more than threats to be eliminated, but there was something in the way he was looking at her now that made her question everything. Without warning, he reached out again, this time cupping her face in his hand. Alina froze, her breath catching in her throat as his thumb brushed lightly across her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost tender, and it made her skin tingle with an unfamiliar warmth. For a moment, the fear that had been gnawing at her seemed to fade, replaced by something else, something dangerous. "I've hunted for a long time," Lucas said softly, his gaze never leaving hers, "but I've never met anyone like you." Alina's heart pounded in her chest, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She had been running from him for so long, fearing that he would end her life, but now she wasn't so sure. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel vulnerable in a way she had never felt before. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Luca's hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her slightly closer. His lips hovered just inches from hers, and Alina's breath hitched in her throat. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why her body was responding to him in this way, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. "I'm not going to kill you," Lucas said, his voice low and rough, "but I can't let you go either." Alina's pulse quickened as his words sank in. She didn't know what he meant by that, didn't know what he intended to do, but the way he was looking at her, the way his hand tightened slightly around her neck, made her blood race. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She was something else entirely, something she didn't recognize. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luca's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something primal in his gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion, "but I can't walk away." The space between them seemed to shrink, and before Alina could process what was happening, his lips crashed against hers in a fierce, desperate kiss. Her body reacted instinctively, her hands tangling in his hair as she kissed him back with equal intensity. The kiss was raw, filled with a hunger that neither of them could explain, but neither of them wanted to stop. Alina's mind was a whirlwind of emotions as Luca's hands roamed over her body, pulling her closer to him. She had never felt anything like this before, this overwhelming desire, this need that consumed her completely. It was as if every nerve in her body was on fire, and the only thing that could quench the flames was him. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their bodies pressed tightly together. Luca's eyes were filled with a mixture of confusion and desire, and Alina knew that whatever had just happened between them had changed everything. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. Luca's grip on her tightened, his expression intense. "Neither do I," he admitted, his voice low, "but I can't stop." Alina's heart raced as his words sank in. She had spent her entire life fearing him, fearing the moment when he would find her and end her life. But now, standing here in the moonlit forest, she realized that her fear had been replaced by something else, something far more dangerous. Desire. It was a desire that consumed her, a desire that made her forget everything she had been running from, and as Luca's lips found hers again, she knew that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. She thought he'd end her, but instead, he had awakened something inside her, something she never knew existed. Alina pulled away, breathless, her mind swirling in confusion and anticipation. The world around them seemed to hold its breath as if even the forest had stilled to witness the moment unfolding between them. This was not how she had imagined things ending. She had prepared herself for death, for the cold certainty of Luca's blade, but this was something else entirely. I can't stay with you, she murmured, her voice shaky, her mind grasping for some sense of control. I'm supposed to keep running. Luca's gaze softened for a brief moment, the intensity of their shared kiss lingering in his eyes. He took a step back, releasing his hold on her, though his presence still pressed heavily in the air between them. His brow furrowed slightly as if he too was wrestling with an internal battle. Running hasn't worked, he said simply, his voice steady but with an undertone that made her pulse quicken again. You know it, I've been trained to find people like you. No matter where you run, I would always catch up. Alina's chest tightened at his words, not because of the threat they carried but because of the truth in them. She had been running her entire life, always looking over her shoulder, always fearing the next attack. And now, after all this time, standing face to face with the man who was supposed to end it all, she realized that running had brought her nothing but exhaustion and emptiness. I don't want to keep fighting, she whispered, her voice almost breaking. Luca's eyes narrowed slightly, his features hardening again, though not with the cold detachment she had once feared. Then don't, he replied, his voice low, almost a growl. Don't fight me, stay. Alina blinked, not understanding the full weight of his words at first. Stay? With him? The man who had been chasing her, hunting her down like prey? It didn't make sense, yet she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward him. The desire that had been sparked in their kiss hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only grown stronger, thrumming beneath her skin like a live wire. I don't know what you want from me, she said, her voice wavering. I'm not like anyone you've met before. Luca's expression shifted, a shadow passing over his face as if he understood something she didn't. He stepped closer again, but this time there was no menace in his movements, no threat. He was careful, measured, his hand reaching out to lightly brush her arm. The touch sent a shiver through her, but not from fear. I know, he said quietly, you're not like anyone, that's why I couldn't kill you. Alina's breath caught in her throat. Those words, so simple and yet so charged with meaning, unraveled something deep inside her. She had always seen herself as a monster, a threat to the world around her, but in Luca's eyes, she saw something else, recognition, maybe even admiration. Then what now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What happens between us? Luca's gaze held hers for a long, intense moment before he spoke. I don't know, but I do know this, you don't have to run anymore. I won't let anyone hurt you. Alina stared at him, her mind racing. Could she really trust him? Could she trust anyone? And yet, in that moment, standing there in the moonlit forest with the man who had once been her enemy, she realized that she didn't have much of a choice. She couldn't keep running, couldn't keep living in fear. Something had to change, and perhaps, just perhaps, Luca was the catalyst for that change. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Luca's hand moved to her face, gently tilting her chin up so that their eyes met again. So am I, he whispered, and for the first time since she had met him, there was vulnerability in his voice. The admission stunned her. This man, who had seemed so invincible, so unyielding, was admitting that he was afraid too. It was a revelation that shook her to the core, and for a brief moment, she saw him not as a hunter, but as someone just as lost as she was. Without thinking, she closed the remaining distance between them, her lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss. It wasn't like their first kiss, filled with desperation and hunger. This one was soft, slow, filled with a sense of mutual understanding. His hand slid to the back of her neck, holding her close as their kiss deepened. When they finally pulled apart, Luca rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. I don't know what we are, he murmured, but I know I'm not letting you go. Alina's heart pounded in her chest, but for the first time in a long while, it wasn't from fear, it was from something else, something unfamiliar and thrilling. She had spent so long trying to survive, trying to avoid the inevitable, that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly live. I don't want you to, she whispered back. Luca's grip on her tightened slightly as if he were afraid that she might vanish if he let go. Then stay, he said again, his voice rough with emotion. Alina closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. Stay, the idea of staying, of not running, was both terrifying and exhilarating, but she knew, deep down, that she couldn't keep living the way she had been. Luca had awakened something inside her, something that couldn't be ignored. I'll stay, she said softly, but what about them? The others like you? They'll keep coming for me. Luca's expression darkened, but his resolve didn't waver. Let them come. I'll protect you. Alina's chest tightened at the intensity of his words, at the promise he was making. She didn't fully understand why he was doing this, why he had chosen her, but she felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. But why? She asked, her voice quiet, unsure if she even wanted the answer. Why are you doing this for me? Luca was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers as if trying to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. Because you're not like the others. You've made me feel something I haven't felt in years, maybe ever. I've spent my life hunting, killing, surviving, but with you, it's different. Alina's breath caught in her throat as his words washed over her. She had always felt alone, isolated in her own existence, but now she wasn't so sure. Luca wasn't just a hunter. He was someone who saw her for who she truly was, not just what she could do. And in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could stop running. I'll stay, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but only if we do this together. Luca's eyes softened, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Together, he agreed, his hand tightening around hers. The forest around them seemed to breathe again, as if it too had been waiting for this moment of clarity. Alina didn't know what the future held, didn't know what dangers still lurked on the horizon. But she did know one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. And as Luca's hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her close once more, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had found something worth staying for. But as they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, neither of them noticed the shadowy figures lurking in the distance, watching, waiting. The hunt wasn't over yet.